Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I am Jalen Jones. Data centers are spreading all across North Carolina, driven by artificial intelligence. They don't look like power plants, but they are quietly reshaping how the state uses electricity and water. Now, WRAL climate change reporter Liz McLaughlin, you join us now. Thank you so much for your time. Liz, you start this story with a data center proposal in southern Wake County. What's being proposed in New Hill, and why is it drawing so much attention?
This is a really interesting project. It's in New Hill. It's a small rural community right near Apex, and it's actually really beautiful, really quiet, rolling farmland. And this proposal is going to kind of turn that into a massive industrial site. So 200-acre property, 4 buildings being proposed, each one the size of roughly a super Walmart. So you can just kind of imagine, the scale of that when these people had, a farm in their backyard. But the concern goes beyond just kind of the location and standard, rezoning argument that happens in most neighborhoods, because there's, it's permanent and people are really worried more about what it consumes than what it will make. So I spent some time walking around with residents there so we can hear from one of them now.
This might be the first of many, an entire corridor. So we want to know the whole plan. Don't give us one by one. Give us the whole state's plan. Where are they? Do we have enough resources, power? I mean, the power vulnerability is huge already. If you look at the energy issue plan, water is an issue, air quality is an issue.
And it's really, like I said, bigger than a rezoning fight. New Hill is really a window of what's happening statewide. And data centers are really being approved one by one, often locally, so really in a silo, and not really looking at the big picture statewide and how it can tax resources or impact people beyond those communities, from things like water use to electricity demand to emissions. It really doesn't stop at the fence line.
Wow. So, okay, I have 2 questions to kind of go off of the beaten path a little bit. These residents, how are they feeling? Because it's like, hey, I bought land because I want to get away from the big city, and then now they don't have a say-so in what's happening in their own backyard. Sounds terrifying a little bit. Also, secondly, these data centers are kind of necessary to boom this triangle, tech companies that are coming into the triangle as well. A little bit about that. Have you talked to the residents?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think a lot of that's common, right? Not in my backyard. You just,
Yes.
if an industrial site has to go somewhere, it's just going to be, if it's in a community, if it's near homes, there's probably going to be some pushback. And to be fair to the developer, I think they are hearing residents out. They're having community meetings. There's feedback and at least a dialogue happening here. Yeah. But the residents are still really concerned, and there's still a lot of unknowns as to the scope of that impact, even the final operator of it, as opposed to the developer. So, so that's really bringing up a lot of concerns. And again, looking at it from a wider level, how the whole state will just deal with that. But that's always a question, right? Or a balance, an algorithm we have to run as a state. Because of course we want economic development. There is a race for AI. There's a lot of money in it. So we want to attract those businesses, we as a state, but at what cost? And I think that's really a fair question. The infrastructure upgrades, how many permanent jobs actually comes from this? A lot of construction jobs, thousands of those, but very few actual permanent jobs, maybe just a couple hundred. So there's really a lot of weighing here, and that's a big criticism from a lot of the residents I spoke with. Is there enough care being taken into this? Are we just trying to get all of those businesses in and just approving these projects, or are we giving it really the criticism, the time to really go through all those decisions and really know at what cost?
So let's take a couple steps back. Correct me if I'm wrong, you said the size of 4 super Walmarts, right? A lot of your reporting talks about translating scale. When people hear 300 megawatt data center, what does that actually mean in regular terms?
Sure, because megawatt, what does that, really mean? And I'll just say, even that number, it's not how much power it uses per year. I mean, we're talking about the size of the pipe that's going to this data center, so the capacity at which they can operate nonstop. And to put it into scale, 300 megawatts is about the equivalent of 200,000 homes in North Carolina running nonstop. So that's how much power going to heat all these homes in North Carolina right now. And that's an average, of course, from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. So there is some variability depending on time of year, but that just gives you an idea. Because when we're talking about demand too, sure, residential growth is part of that, but you'd have to have 200,000 people move to the state for the impact of just one of these data centers.
Yes.
And so when you start talking about multiple projects throughout the state, I mean, the impact on the power grid grows really quickly.
So essentially a great migration happens overnight in North Carolina, in Wake County. And now Duke Energy has to accommodate for all those people and all that power that needs to be additionally on top of what we already use. That context kind of breaks my brain a little bit, and I'm not going to lie. And so seeing these massive, I guess, power sources that are going to have to be built and in the AI data centers as well. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. Another resource, I've read a little bit about this. How much water does these data centers use? Because it's a couple, I think a Southern county, they're having a water conservation effort. We've had multiple water issues here in North Carolina. Now these data centers are going to pull in how much water?
So the actual number is a little bit finicky. There's some range and some estimates, and some of the data is a little unclear. They don't necessarily have to report how much water they use, but just how they work. You know, it's tons of these servers, massive computing power that generates intense heat, and that has to be cooled. So often that's using water. And you know, it depends on the place, but for instance, the New Hill proposal during peak use, so that's, you know, on the hot days in the summer, it could use 1 million gallons a day just to cool those servers. And to put that in perspective, that's about a fifth of what the whole town of Apex uses in water use each day. So it's a substantial amount. And that developer, for instance, they're going to use reclaimed wastewater, which sounds really good, right? But actually only 2/3 of that can actually be recycled. And the rest of that can be lost. I spoke with Jackson Ewing, who's Jackson Ewing, who's a climate and energy policy expert at Duke University. Here's what he had to say.
It's significant. You know, a medium-sized data center, for example, can use about the same amount of water as a small town. Much of this water is just evaporated, and so it doesn't get back into the local watersheds.
So even when the average use is lower than peak, so say in the winter, I mean, that evaporation represents a net loss to the river basin, which can be a huge problem, especially in times of drought or extreme heat, which of course is becoming more common with climate change.
Well, we're going to take a short break. You're listening to WRAL Daily Download, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're here talking with climate change reporter Liz McLaughlin about the rapid growth of data centers across North Carolina. This has been a hot topic issue, also kind of a little bit of a water cooler issue as well, and what basically these data centers mean for energy, water, costs. A lot of this is going to backfill into the community as well. New Hill is just one site. How widespread is this trend across North Carolina? Because we're talking about the mountains all the way out west to the beach all the way out east. What are you looking at?
Yeah, I mean, there's dozens of data centers either proposed or already operating in the state, from rural counties, you know, west of Charlotte to here in the Triangle. And really what's driving this surge is, of course, artificial intelligence. You know, data centers have existed before. The whole internet's processed through there, but just simply the high computing power that's needed. And it's not just us putting in a query to ChatGPT, right? Businesses are using really high-end training models that are, you know, sending millions of prompts at the same time. So that's really driving a lot of that use, a lot of that growth. But we're not, state officials I talk to, state regulators, DEQ, they don't look at this from an entire statewide scale. Locally, they might do a permit by permit, but they're not saying, oh, we've already approved these 8 data centers. What does that mean for our water? There's no cumulative analysis for it. So a lot of people are really concerned by that. Are we going to, get in trouble? All of these things, once they're built, right, they're in. Are we going to be in above our head as far as managing our resources, especially 10, 20 years from now, maybe when drought's more common, when heat's more common, and you're going to need even more resources for that cooling power. So no statewide inventory, as far as I could tell, no cumulative analysis collectively on what that could mean for emissions or water supply or even infrastructure. And that's why, some experts say that the pace of growth is really outstripping the way it's being planned for.
A little bit of a side question. Is there any red flags that are going to pop up in the future that let us know, hey, I think we've bitten off a little bit more than we can chew here?
I mean, sure, we can look to other states too. Some are a little more ahead of this and already grappling with trying to manage energy demand, especially in times of peak use. We saw just this week, right? Duke Energy asking its customers to turn the heat down to limit your power use. And that might be something that you see more often. Now, one thing that some other states have explored is, for instance, if a business, maybe it's not us. When we write something in ChatGPT, we want an answer immediately, of course. But some businesses training these AI models, they might be able to do that between 2 and 6 a.m. or some off-peak times. So there's some negotiating that's happening on, their highest power use being at off-peak times as a way to manage it. But, at the end of the day, I think one of the big questions here is about the resource load. I mean, Duke Energy directly said that they're changing the way that the grid works, relying on fossil fuels longer, building out more infrastructure to meet a growing demand. And so if that locks us into fossil fuel use over the next 20 years, again, it's just that analysis, the trade-off. Have we fully examined if that's worth it? Fuel volatility is one big thing driving up our power bills. So if we're relying more on fuel that is volatile and some international trade changes, some of our domestic supply changes, and that goes through the roof, guess what? We're all paying for that because, we're locked into that base load generation. And maybe, renewables would have been cheaper in that way. But we're trying to satisfy these industrial customers.
And before we jump off that point a little bit, it's almost a double-edged sword because also emissions. So a little bit about that. Could you speak on our possible emissions and the standards that need to be enacted or at least kept with these additional power centers?
So for years, Duke has said, we can't rely on renewables as much as we originally planned, and specifically because of load growth. So for instance, now the growth they're expecting is 8 times faster over the next 15 years than it was over the past 15 years. So that's a huge whoop up in the in the graph, right? And so to meet that demand, they say in the near term, they'll need to rely more on fossil fuels. So that includes retiring coal plants later. They're supposed to retire all their coal plants, or they had plans to, because of the carbon plan, by a certain year, by 2030. And now it's going to be years after in their most recent resource plan, and building out new natural gas plants or adding more sites on current gas plants. So those choices really matter because power plants and transmission lines are really long-term investments that shape emissions for decades. And recent legislation allowed Duke to do that because it took away the interim emissions target. Basically, net zero by 2050, Duke says that's still their goal, but they were supposed to meet some other deadlines, right, in the next 5-10 years. And so basically the legislature decided to remove that interim target. The logic was, well, in the near term, we're going to need this. And by the time we get to late 2030s, we can use some technologies like small modular nuclear, hydrogen, that are zero carbon and are going to be more accessible. But we can't really do that in the meantime. But there's a lot of argument over that, and what that looks like. But if you're building a whole new gas plant, you're not going to just stop using that, turn the power off, right? In 10 or 20 years. Some of them are hydrogen capable, but you're really locking in, decades of use there. And especially if you're building new transmission lines specifically for that generation.
Wow. I have 1,000 questions. More questions. We could sit here all day and talk about it. For people who do not live near a data center or they don't have one planned in their community, why should they care?
I mean, the impacts just don't stop at the fence line. Meeting this level of demand really requires across the grid upgrades, new power plants, like I mentioned, those new transmission lines, infrastructure improvement. And we're all going to be footing the bill for that. Mm-hmm. And actually, under recent legislation passed last year, the same one that took away that interim emissions deadline, Senate Bill 266, it also changed a little bit the formula of how electricity is charged, how our electricity bill works, and actually shifted more of the cost of construction, of grid upgrades, of that fuel volatility onto residential users from industrial users. So that really ruffled a lot of feathers. And that legislation, by the way, was introduced by a former Duke executive. So, a lot of people were concerned about that. And it was even called the Power Bill Reduction Act. But a lot of people asked, reduction for who? Because, as residents, we hear a lot of viewers saying, my rates just keep going up and up and up. And for the future, it seems to be that will be the trajectory. Duke says that large customers do pay to connect their specific facility to the grid, but that broader upgrades are shared. And I talked to Jeff Brooks with Duke Energy about that.
When we look at our long-term planning over the next 10 years, we anticipate around 20 gigawatts of new generation to be built in the state. When we think about the grid as a whole, when we think about adding new transmission lines and new power plants that generate for everybody, those costs are typically socialized appropriately across all rates.
And really, residents and researchers that I spoke with say that raises a fundamental question about fairness, right? I mean, who benefits from this growth and who ultimately pays for it, both financially and environmentally? These are some of the richest companies in the world. We're talking about Meta, Amazon, Apple. A lot of people are asking, why should you and I be subsidizing that? Mm-hmm. For them, New Hill just isn't about one project. It's really about how North Carolina manages this explosive AI-driven growth and without quietly locking in these higher costs and higher emissions and just a greater strain on shared resources.
Wow. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. This is the WRAL Daily Download. For more information about data centers, energy, and climate in North Carolina, go to WRAL.com. You can catch all of Liz's reporting on this topic.